Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a conflict that literally redrew the map of North America, the Mexican-American War, which ran from 1846 to 1848. But instead of just giving you a dry list of dates and battles, we're going to look at this complex war spatially across the continent. To truly grasp how the whole thing unfolded, we need to break down the military operations into three distinct geographic fronts: Texas and northern Mexico, California, and central Mexico. It's kind of like a grand chessboard, and today we're tracking all the major moves. Here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the spark, that disputed Texas border. Then we'll explore those three distinct theaters of military operations I just mentioned: the Northern Front, the Pacific Coast out in California, and finally, the central thrust straight into the heart of Mexico. We'll wrap the whole thing up by looking at the massive consequences in America's brand new map. All right, part one, the spark, disputed Texas border. Okay, let's dive right into this. Long before the armies actually marched, the stage was set by a massive geographical disagreement. The roots of this war go back to 1845, when the United States annexed the Republic of Texas. That single move basically transformed a regional feud between Mexico and Texas into a full-blown international standoff. You see, the U.S. claimed the southern border of Texas was the Rio Grande River. But Mexico, they claimed the border was the Nueces River, which sits a whopping 150 miles to the north. This created a huge, overlapping flashpoint known as the Nueces Strip, and both sides were absolutely convinced that this land was rightfully theirs. So tensions are high, and they finally boil over in April 1846. U.S. President James K. Polk had sent troops down into that disputed Nueces Strip. A Mexican cavalry detachment ended up running into an American patrol, resulting in a deadly clash known as the Thornton Affair, where 16 American soldiers lost their lives. When the news made its way back to Washington, President Polk delivered a stark, uncompromising message to Congress. He stated that American blood had been shed upon American soil. And with that momentum, on May 13, 1846, Congress officially approved a declaration of war.
Moving right along to Section 2, Texas and northern Mexico.
With war declared, we shift to our first major theater of operations, down in the south. The U.S. War Department mobilized the Army of Occupation, putting it under the command of General Zachary Taylor. And let me tell you, Taylor moved fast. Right around the time war was officially being declared, he secured rapid, decisive victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, completely pushing the Mexican army back across the Rio Grande. By September, his forces had pushed deep into northern Mexico, eventually engaging in brutal, close-quarters urban combat at Monterrey. We're talking 3 days of intense, block-by-block street fighting before the Mexican forces finally surrendered. Fast forward a bit to early 1847. The U.S. strategy shifts, and a lot of Taylor's troops get reassigned. This left him garrisoned with a heavily depleted volunteer force of just 5,000 men. Well, Mexican General Santa Anna sees this golden opportunity and marches a massive army of 20,000 soldiers north. At the Battle of Buena Vista, Taylor's forces were outnumbered 4-1. To put that into perspective, that's an absolutely overwhelming disadvantage. Yet, by locking down a really strong defensive position in a mountain pass, the Americans miraculously withstood furious assaults for a day and a half. Santa Anna was eventually forced to withdraw, marking the last major engagement on the northern front.
Up next, Section 3, Capture and Rebellion of California. Let's move thousands of miles west to the Pacific Coast and see how this builds, because the operations out in California were completely uncoordinated at first. The whole thing actually kicked off when a small group of American immigrants just seized the town of Sonoma and declared their own independent California Republic. Soon after that, the U.S. Navy rolls up, occupying coastal cities like Monterrey and San Francisco without even firing a single shot. But, this wasn't just an easy walkover. The Mexican citizens living there, the Californios, fiercely resisted. They pushed back hard, actually retaking Los Angeles in late 1846. It ultimately took a mashed-up, merged force of U.S. Navy sailors, Marines, and Army dragoons arriving all the way from New Mexico to finally secure the region in January 1847.
Section 4, Central Front, Siege of Mexico City. So we leave the Pacific and anchor ourselves back in the east for the final and absolutely most critical front of the war. Despite the U.S. controlling northern Mexico and California, the Mexican government flat out refused to negotiate. On top of that, overland supply lines from the north were becoming pretty much impossible to maintain. So what do? The U.S. decides to strike directly at the heart of Mexico. General Winfield Scott led a strategic amphibious invasion at the coastal city of Veracruz. Instead of launching a horribly costly direct assault against the city's heavily fortified walls and its 4,300 defenders, Scott wisely decided to just lay siege to the city, bombarding it from afar. It was a brilliant tactical move that bypassed a bloodbath and secured a totally vital coastal supply line for the U.S. Army. From Veracruz, Scott's Army of Invasion kicked off an aggressive 265-mile inland march right toward the capital. And this was a relentless campaign. Scott consistently overcame much larger Mexican forces and incredibly tough mountainous geographic obstacles. He outflanked Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo in April, then smashed through Contreras and Churubusco in August. Finally, by September 1847, U.S. forces were standing at the very last major obstacle guarding Mexico City, the towering Chapultepec Castle. Now, what's really interesting about this part is a deeply poignant human story embedded right within the siege. Chapultepec Castle actually served as a Mexican military academy. During the massive U.S. bombardment and the storming of the fortress that followed, the Mexican commanding general officially surrendered. But 6 young student cadets flatly refused to abandon their posts. They fought the advancing American army to the absolute death. To this day, they are immortalized in Mexico as Los Niños Héroes, the boy heroes. It's a really powerful reminder of the fierce resistance on the Central Front. The very next day, U.S. forces occupied Mexico City.
And that brings us to Section 5, Consequences, America's New Map.
The fall of the capital essentially ended the major military operations, setting the stage for 1848 and the stark final accounting of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, the human cost was devastating. We're looking at 17,000 U.S. casualties, largely from disease, and 25,000 Mexican casualties. But the territorial shift, it was absolutely staggering. For a payment of $15 million, Mexico ceded literally half of its entire national territory to the United States. This one single treaty added California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other future states to the U.S., finally expanding the country all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But we have to remember, this pursuit of expansion, what we often call manifest destiny, was deeply controversial back home. There was intense domestic outrage. A lot of Northerners opposed the war, fearing it was just an excuse to carve out new slave states in the West. Prominent figures spoke out fiercely against the whole thing. Congressman Henry Clay condemned the war, calling it unnecessary and offensive aggression. And the famous writer Henry David Thoreau, he literally went to jail rather than pay taxes to support what he saw as a completely unjust invasion. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this war didn't just change the map, it forged the very men who would soon tear that map apart. Just consider some of the officers who served in Mexico. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson. These guys fought side by side. They learned logistics, tactics, and how to command under heavy fire, all on the fronts of Mexico. They gained an intimate familiarity with each other's specific habits and strategies. It was the exact combat training they would soon deploy against one another just a little over a decade later. Which leaves us with this final thought. The Mexican-American War achieved the ultimate expansionist dream, stretching the United States from coast to coast. But by acquiring all of that brand new territory, the nation immediately began tearing itself apart over whether or not slavery would be allowed to expand into it. So I want to leave you with this question. Did the very victory that fulfilled America's manifest destiny inevitably guarantee its own devastating civil war? Think about that for a bit. I really hope this explainer helped you see the whole board clearly. Thanks so much for watching.